Did the Cloud Native Security Village ever come together, Frederick, for KubeCon North America? You're muted, Frederick. Did we lose Frederick? We may have lost Frederick.
Sorry, I cut out for a moment. Can you repeat?
Did a security village ever come together for KubeCon North America?
I will know shortly. Recent calls have been canceled because of because people are doing their reviews. So in the very near future,
Also, it's July. That's how July goes.
Yeah. So once, but once we reconvene, and then I will. It's one of the first things I will ask.
Okay. And I should probably check back on the build tool. So anything else that we should be aware of in terms of upcoming events that we need to get on people's radar?
Is anyone going to have, or is anyone attending either DEF CON or Black Hat out of curiosity? Like, I don't think we're doing anything in those, but would like to know.
I'm not currently planning on attending, but there's a slight possibility that may shift.
Yeah. There's a small chance I may go.
Okay. Cool. And a reminder to folks, please feel free to update the agenda yourselves as we go. It is an open agenda. On the community outreach side, I haven't heard back from Julia. I should probably reach out again and see sort of like what I can find out there on the Python side. Is there anything else that folks want to update on the community outreach tools and tracking sheet? Okay. Anything from our POCs or questions from implementers? Okay. SPDX, the SPDX folks, as I mentioned here, we probably want to follow up with them with a PR to help with the input manifest terminology. And it looks like you had an interesting overheard discussion you wanted to discuss here, DVP?
Yeah, so I was at a career day thing for cybersecurity at a local university. And one of the people there was somebody who does post-breach forensics for financial services institution. And one of the things that she was lamenting was the fact that there was really no chain of custody for devices and for systems. And I'm like, oh, how about if you had just a nice SHA-256 that actually gave you the chain of custody? And yeah, this is a little bit of a fantasy overextension of what we've been talking about so far with OmniBOR. But I don't think it's a huge stretch.
I would say it's the logical conclusion.
I wouldn't. I'll disagree with the word conclusion, but a logical
progression.
Yeah, and it might actually be interesting if we can get some of the Cisco security and trust people to come in and talk to us about how Cisco does chain of custody with hardware, because there's a lot of signatures and a lot of other stuff related to chain of custody with hardware, so that Cisco can actually validate that certain parts of at least on the firewall, I believe this is also true in routers, have not been tampered with by anyone physically in transit.
Yeah, no, there's a long history of that, and I have no ideas which ones I can discuss publicly or not, but the people you're referring to would.
Yes.
Um,
But
so.
I think it, you know, once again, this is maybe an outgrowth of my desire to think about not just the technical aspects of Omnibor, but kind of the socio-business, why this actually matters aspects. And I think it does dovetail with the SPDX stuff, which is if they're going to consider Omnibor as, you know, enhancements to a bill of materials, figuring out some logical waypoints or some logical extensions to how those things can be used in industry, I think would make a lot of sense.
And I know from the discussion I had with the SPDX3 folks, part of why they were really interested there was because they could clearly see that there would be other kinds of metadata that people would care about that you wouldn't necessarily want to stuff in the SBOM, right? SBOMs are super important, they're super useful, but like they can't be the kitchen sink of all possible metadata. Otherwise, you start having other problems. And so if you have the input manifest ID for something in your SBOM, then you can correlate it with all kinds of other metadata sets.
Yeah.
And that immediately made sense to them.
Cool.
So another issue as well is people tend to look at these things as either I 100% trust it or I 100% don't trust it. And there's a rich gradient between the two of them that is useful, where perhaps you trust something, but under certain circumstances you may trust it less, but given enough other evidence you may trust it more, and so on and so on. And so I think that anything that helps with anything that helps in that particular perspective to help people reason through that kind of stuff in the long run, I think will be useful, and
Well,
I think that we play a good part there.
Oh, absolutely. And trust really has to do with sort of like how much is on the line. I had the good fortune of spending some time with a really deep security guy very early in my career who did a lot of consulting. And his comment was, the first question he always asked a client was, so how much money are we talking about if this goes wrong? And he said, get some people who would give him one answer and he'd give them a set of appropriate considerations. He apparently once consulted for a central bank and their answer was in the trillions. And his response was, now is the time to start talking about pressurized wire conduits. Because when you're dealing with that kind of thing, you pressurize your wire conduits because the downside is so steep that you want to know whether somebody has gone in and tapped your wires.
Yeah, and looking at this from the software supply chain side, it's one of the things that I've had to work out some answers towards. It's like, well, we're doing this thing with OmniBOR, and it's like, well, that doesn't matter because the compiler is not trusted. And it's like, well, having a compiler that is compromised is certainly something we want to defend against, but it's not the only thing we want to defend against. And so we trust the level that we trust in that particular scenario has to take all of that into account, and to throw a whole bunch of things out because a possible path may eventually be compromised, and basically forgoing a whole bunch of other useful information is detrimental, especially when that information can be used to can be correlated with other things, where you say, hey, we see that things that have this compiler version with these inputs tend to have this output, and we see another one that has a different output. Like that's probably probably material.
Well, I mean, this sort of gets around to, I at one point had to defend a thing I wanted to do to a bunch of InfoSec folks. they were savaging me with the various problems within. The question is always compared to what, right? Because the thing I pointed out to them was the thing I wanted to do was moderately more secure than SSH. And so my question to them was, do you allow SSH? And of course, the answer was, yes, we allow SSH. It's like, oh, great. So we all acknowledge that I have potential security vulnerabilities in what I want to do, but they're less than the security vulnerabilities available in SSH. So, and you allow SSH. Can we proceed? Grumble, 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 grumble. Yes, we can proceed. So.
But no, I totally agree with Frederick's point, especially related to risk management, because we're not looking at a silver bullet solution for a point incident. We are looking at creating a mechanism by which enterprises, which probably have services, you know, the number of services that they have running is probably in the 10,000s. The number of iterations of those services, you know, it might be 25 or 30,000 a year, more if the, you know, enterprise is agile. So you're managing stuff by moles. I think we get back into the mole discussion. Rather than managing it by, you know, individual atoms. And yeah, if you can basically say there's a higher risk over in this collection of atoms, that then, you know, that's the kind of management tool that an SVP or a VP can like latch onto and say, I'm going to, you know, create incentives or, you know, whatever to focus more on the security side rather than the feature velocity side for this particular corpus of services. But I think that, you know, at the high level, that's what Omnibor is ultimately going to help with. It's also going to help with the post facto forensics. It's like, how much of the system can we trust? And how much of the system can we not trust that we actually have to have a human go in and do some stuff around?
Yep.
Yeah. And there's two particular areas that I think when we're talking to CISOs that we should probably focus on as well, which I think it will also tie into digital forensics. Like the thing, if you go through the CISSP that they tend to aim for, one of the things they stress is the residual value of the security control, which is very simply put that whatever it is that you're defending has a specific value, and if the cost to protect that is higher than that value, then something has gone terribly wrong, and you've provided negative value by securing it. And it also begs the question: if it's sensitive and you can't secure properly, should you even be doing it? The second part to it is related towards the total, because that's all about the cost. But the second part to that is when talking with CISOs. I think if you put it quite well with that, like looking at it from moles, and that's not an analogy I've used before, I had heard before. But I think that when we're talking with CISOs, the question becomes, how can we take the things that we're doing and drive down the total cost so that residual value becomes greater? And if we can show that we've reduced the cost of securing the system in one path, then that opens up opportunities to spend in other areas. And so I think that we have to 100% have to tie this towards the whole economics at scale in order for the stuff we're doing to be successful.
If I could suggest that we segue this into the how does Omnibor benefit folks discussion, and if folks could please, let me stick the link in here, start capturing some of this there, and I'm happy to capture some of it too. Let me stick this in the chat, because effectively, you know, we've had a really good conversation. We've had this conversation multiple times, we need to I think, start capturing some of this here in this discussion, and then boiling it down to, CISO consumable bullet points, if you will, about how this benefits them. Because essentially, it gives you the ability to actually take the temperature, so to speak, of different corners of your molarity level collection of things in a way that you just can't now. And Frederick, feel free to add that into the discussion here, because I think this is probably the right place to capture all of it.
Yeah, I think we probably need a document targeting the CISO that answers the question, so what?
Please add that here, please, for the love of God. Type.
Well, but I think that's an important point, which is we really do need targeted messaging. So CISOs are one target. What are like 2 or 3 other targets? I mean, for me, I think one of them targets is a VP of engineering. How am I going to allocate my resources, and why do I care about Omnibor in terms of resource allocation?
I have literally had this conversation with VPs of engineering, and it's interesting because they've got a somewhat different perspective, because there's a finite number of resources in any organization to allocate to something. And people are literally drowning right now in false positives on the CVE front. And the resolution to 90% plus of them is, I don't have that CVE, and probably 80% of them are, I don't have that component, but some SCA scanner told me I did.
Yeah. In my prior life, I experienced that. But that gets back into risk management. And the question is, can we, at a factual level, can we augment an SCA? But at a conceptual level, just setting, kind of ingesting Omnibor stuff, and whether that's, ingested into as part of one of the signing rituals.
Well, one of the nice things about the embedding with Omnibor is that eventually, transparently, we become part of the signing rituals. Because if you're signing an artifact and the artifact contains the Omnibor ID, then by virtue of signing the artifact, you sign the Omnibor ID. You have become part of the signing ritual.
So this is where I'm a little bit queasy on that one, because of the way that the spec discussion that we've been having. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of bifurcation in the spec discussion as to whether you want to embed at least one of the IDs in any given artifact or not. And, mm-hmm. In other words, whether the Omnibor receipt directory, etc., is an adjunct to or included in the artifact. So if you're signing an artifact, mm-hmm. does that include signing the Omnibor directory, which contains the receipts? And I think that might be a very interesting part of the spec discussion.
Well, let me sort of generalize very slightly, which is that because of the Merkle tree nature of the Omnibor input manifests, even if we choose a way to correlate an input manifest ID to an artifact that is not a means of embedding, all you need to actually do is sign the correlation of the input manifest ID to the artifact. Because the Merkle tree nature of the artifact dependency graph means that once I have correlated an artifact, an input manifest ID with an artifact, I don't need to question what goes on below that.
I agree with that, with 2 caveats. The first one is you're now talking about signing 2 different things, even though the signature is simply a signature of a hash. But the second part of that is the metadata question, and how much are we including metadata in the Merkle tree? Do we have two Merkle trees? Do we have kind of just the raw hash or the raw Gitoid Merkle tree versus do we have the Gitoid plus metadata Merkle tree?
So
I got a project that grapples with some of these questions, and part of what I've done is left. Of course, the Omnibor itself is Omnibor, right? And what I've done is I've created additional metadata that references those various IDs, and with the idea being that I can correlate information with it, but ultimately I'm taking the Gitoid and adding that Gitoid of that final object into the into the in toto based specification or output that we can then use at a later time to validate what has happened in the state of the system at given locations. And the metadata that I'm collecting includes information about the state of the system and state of the file system. And I start off with focusing on the file system as like, what does the file system look like at a given moment before we run a given process, and include information about what user ID was used, what were the permissions, and so on. And correlating the Gitoids of that particular system and tying it back into that path. I should probably do a presentation on it soon here, so I can talk about the details of it.
But I think at the root of what you're really getting at there is that we're also accustomed to talking about the world in terms of signing. And I think we need to start shifting to thinking about the world in terms of attestation.
Yeah,
and
well, also,
different things are going to be attested by different entities at different times and in different ways.
And I'll give a really clear example. All of our attestations that we've been talking about have been, these are the inputs to my compiler correlated to the output. But there's other types of attestations that can be created as well. Like in the case of the project that I did, I wanted to have a cryptographic representation of a file system to be able to determine if any of the content had changed. So what I did was I took all of the directories, and I couldn't use the standard Git style directory tree, because the format of it does not suit the needs that we have. And so part of what I ended up doing there was including like these particular files belong to a directory, but using the Omnibor specification to track that. So it's the same. It ends up being the same thing, but it's basically I have something that when composed together may lead into the creation of something else. And what is that thing? And that's ultimately the thing I'm trying to get towards here, is that it's important to look at not just the fact that ID exists, but to answer the question of why does it exist in the way that it does? Like, what was the path used to create that identity, so that we're able to perform a proper attestation, best case scenario, a repeatable attestation of that thing. But even if it's not repeatable, it's still useful information, because I have something before that has a claim that I built it in this way, even if the only proof we have is a signature of the process.
Yeah. So I mean, but overall, I think we sort of talked about that one through a fair bit. Do we want to move on to the metadata for Omnibor discussion?
I think so.
And I do apologize. I've been traveling and whatnot. There may have been some action items here on me on this one. So let's sort of bring this back a bit into relief. So I think you originally brought this up, Barathi, as part of a discussion where you were basically suggesting that rather than Okay, so I think you were suggesting something about rather than sticking things in the metadata directory, Bharathi.
Right, the naming of the file that contains the metadata. So I was just thinking if having the Omnibor ID with an extension would, would be, it was one of my proposal, but the downside to that is the argument that we can have multiple artifacts having the same input manifest. So the metadata for them could be different, but the Omnibor ID could be the same. So in which case, it will not be easy to distinguish using just the Omnibor ID, right? You can't distinguish which metadata is for which artifact, given that both the artifacts have the same input manifest. So I think that is not. I think that rules it out. So we need to.
Well, I mean, it rules out the particulars of your suggestion.
Yeah,
It doesn't read per se on the observation that you made and the fact that we may want to think a little bit more about it. And it may or may not shift away from having the metadata directory. But I think fundamentally what you were really getting at is how do I make it really easy to go find and correlate any metadata that I may have about this thing, right?
Yes, yes. And as we before, this is a problem that will that is likely to come up even if we find a different naming scheme. So basically, the naming scheme should account for the fact that what if two artifacts have the same Omnibor ID, or like we need to ensure that there is the conflicts are also understood.
Yes, yeah, I would agree with that. And that's, that yes. Do we?
The other suggestion was using artifact IDs, though there is, I think, less likelihood of a conflict of two compilers producing the same artifact, because these days there is at least there is a .ident, or there is some section that's particular to given compiler, say GCC or Clang. So there is usually some difference. So it's but then you could compile a file with different options and result in the same artifact. So if, say, the command line options is one of the metadata we are recording, then again we can have two artifacts which the artifact IDs are identical. So if we use the artifact ID as in the naming scheme of metadata, then there is still theoretically a conflict possible, but I would think it's less likely, even though there is a non-zero probability of that happening.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I would agree with all of that. And so basically, if we have the artifact ID, I mean, effectively, you sort of have the artifact ID for the metadata would give you more space for that if you basically have the tools that are separated. And I'm trying to think how this works its way into the spec, because I think, effectively, this starts to flow into the recommendations we might make about how to structure your metadata if you're a build tool. But because each build tool is going to have somewhat different needs, behaviors, whatever, we could provide some recommendations there, but I don't know that we necessarily pin it down by force. I guess the question I would come to is, in terms of things we want to sort of resolve, does it make sense to continue to have a separate metadata directory with these contexts so that different tools have their own space to play in? Does that still make sense in your mind?
Yeah, the different directory structure, that is fine. The last thing is, what is the name of this file that you're going to give to the, is it just going to be Omnibor /metadata context, which is GCC or LLVM, and after that what?
if I could make a suggestion, which is, yeah, I mean, my suggestion is we were currently leaving that open for the individual build tools to figure out, because you don't necessarily have to specify everything up front. We've basically specified a way to keep build tools from stomping on each other. And so I think there's sort of two ways to look at this. One is a spec discussion, which is, do we want to specify some guidance here? And it may be too early for that. And the other one is, since we have people actively doing POCs, do we want to have a discussion here about ideas about how for POCs we might separate the metadata? In which case, you know, basically, to a certain extent, having stuff by artifact ID does make sense to me. Does that make sense to you?
I do see less conflicts with two artifact IDs being identical, but
Okay.
but if I compile the same file with, say, two different optimization levels, and maybe some optimizations don't matter to that code, so I could still generate the same artifact. So what I'm saying is, it is possible for, or even you know, I think it's less likely that GCC and Clang would generate identical artifacts. But even then, I think we are mitigating that by putting them in different context directories. So that is taken care of. But if we use artifact IDs, so what do we do for if conflicts arise for identical artifacts with different metadata? So that'll, I think that maybe a test will have, we have to see, run a test build and see how practical of a conflict that is.
Yeah, that may be a good way to resolve it. One question I do have, which is, are we okay with this particular PR, which has been hanging out, being merged, that provides some of these examples? Because I believe this was in response to your observation that we needed more examples here. Rathi.
I think that is good. So the discussion of naming is after, is probably a stage after we define this. Yes. So this, I think, is good.
Okay.
Yeah, the motivation for that is, how do we correlate the metadata with the artifact? So where a high level overview of where the metadata and how it is placed, I think, is what is discussed in this review. The clarity that I was looking at was, how can we, like, without too much complexity, say that this metadata corresponds to this.
Yep, agreed. Okay. So on active discussions, I think tagging inputs, convergence and divergence. I don't think we have Jeremy here today. We've talked about this here. So I'm actually gonna pull this up. Well, I'm gonna leave that for so moving on to update to better reflect input manifest language. And I think we've gone through and talked about this somewhat, but this, I think, is still a work in progress in the spec, if I recall. Oh, we've gone round and round on the output input manifest. And I think the consensus was to introduce the concept of an artifact input manifest immediately shortened to referring to it as the input manifest within the context of Omnibor. I think that was the consensus we arrived at last time. And I apologize, this is just stuff where I need to put fingers to keyboard on that one. Comment insertion of Omnibor IDs. This was an attempt to go sorting through for Omnibor identifiers. And I think we'd had some, but not a lot of discussion on this. I know you've done some experimentation on this with patch, Barathi, so you probably have more thoughts on this than a lot of folks. But the basic idea was just to have something that looks like a prefix, similar to what SPDX does. And then capture it as a list of input manifest IDs on a single line. And
Yes,
so
that's
this,
we're going to look at how the editors handle the comments for different languages, but I haven't had a chance to do that. I don't know if anyone else had it, but I think that's a good idea to investigate how editors distinguish files with different file extensions.
yep.
But the overall format is, I think, in accordance with what we've done in patch, and that seems to work.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. And then there was the placement. I semi borrowed this from someplace in Go because they had something where, you know, comment line should be placed before the first non-comment, non-blank text in the file. But again, I think this needs a little bit more baking. I do apologize. I've been really, really remiss in getting back to some of these items. Please note, anyone should feel free to pick these things up. I don't take offense. And then we've got back to the embedded mode discussion. Do we want to dive back into embedded mode at this time? Because I feel like we've talked through the available points. There's some thought or idea that has to pop up here.
What was the conclusion of that? I don't remember.
We didn't per se have a conclusion. We've sort of been going round and round the issue because I think there's a generic sense that a non-embedded mode is useful. But the question then becomes, how do you allow the handoff between things? And I think it really comes down to the correlation. In that you need some way to correlate an input manifest to an artifact for the next build tool up the line. And it's not all.
My concern has been that when you modify, when you embed, you modify an executable or something like an executable. And when you do that, you've changed the hash of that itself. And that a lot of people use or rely on hashes of executables to identify things accurately. And that might break a lot of things. So that is my concern. I don't know that that's been addressed.
It's sort of similar to some other concerns that have been raised. So, you know, for example, I think Young Kui's baseline brownfielding for existing DPDK packages, right? You want to be able to go through and reproduce the build of a thing that hadn't been built with OmniBOR. And it really doesn't matter precisely how you're measuring whether or not you've reproduced the same thing in that case. Pretty much everybody on the outbound side of reproduction is looking for byte equivalence. And so that would result in a different, if you embedded it, would result in a different set of binaries. So.
Yeah,
I think part of the way that I try to think through this as well is that it matters when the signing or the hash occurs. So let's say that I'm doing things based off of SHA-256, and that happens to be something that included the getoid of the OmniBOR identifier that's present. then what we're signing is the artifact which happens to embed some identifier or set of identifiers from the tree. But if it's something that was already built and we happen to build up a graph to help with that, then there's no way that that information could be signed without ever changing that. So I think that there are cases where it just works depending on where you generate the Gidoids, and other scenarios where the only plausible path is through information that is kept external from the system because there's no plausible way to inject it.
Yeah. So I guess the root problem then comes down to how do we handle the correlation? Because there's been an attempt made to handle the correlation via having a link farm created. Because the fundamental problem you wind up with the correlation is that once you remove the embedding, then the correlation of an artifact to an input manifest is potentially many input manifests could correlate to the same artifact. And so then you need to be able to be able to have a reasonable way to record that, and then B, you need to be able to have a reasonable way to record that, and then B, you need to be able to, having done that, choose among the available input manifests. And I think that was the place we were getting hung up. Does that sound about where folks feel like we were getting hung up as well?
Yes, that's right.
And that's the place where I sort of feel like there's a need for a new idea or a new thought. And I'm very, very open to thoughts folks may have.
One of the suggestions was, I think, just to have build logs and just output information in the build logs, and then use, have a script that parses the build logs and makes these associations. I think that was discussed. I'm not sure if it was context or something else.
Well, but that's also presuming a unitary build run, right? That you're basically doing a single run through the build at one time, and so you have a single build log to parse. And there are certain systems for which that's true, and there are a lot of systems for which that's not true.
I wonder if Yonke does that, or is that or do you achieve the mapping through other means through the build logs, or if I recall, I think it is that you just concatenate all the output and have a script that parses it. But like you said, if you have parallel builds, and there could be we could easily miss the association in that case.
Let me ask a sort of a very fundamental question here. Actually, a couple of them. One of which will get very snicky, or very particular rather. The first one is, if we have multiple inputs manifests that happen to produce the same artifact, do we really care which one we pick?
So the question is multiple. Can you please repeat it once again? Sorry.
So if we have multiple input manifests that correlate to the same output artifact, does it really matter which one we pick?
Maybe.
Okay, can you give me an example? I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot. This is not like asking a question to disprove a point, but do we know?
Well, so I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is one of the things we're concerned about, or primarily concerned about, is whether the same ingredients produce the final product. And if you have two different types of manifests and they produce the same product, how do you know that the ingredients haven't been tampered with?
So let me back up for a second, though. Let me back up. The reason we care about whether or not there's been tampering is because we're concerned that the tampering results in, say, for example, some new vulnerability in the output.
Yes.
So if I tamper, yep. So if I tamper with,
yeah.
if I tamper with the inputs in a manner that does not result in a change in the output, then was my tampering impactful in any meaningful way, I guess is the question.
I think it is when you take into consideration things like licensing. In the case of a CVE, probably not.
So yeah, in the case of a CVE, I would say not. I would say in the case of anything functional, I would say probably not, right? So, because I know we've had people talk about wanting to look at power usage or performance and other kinds of bugs. So in the case of anything functional, I would say probably not. In terms of licensing, just to take the apocryphal example of, let's say you have an open source project that relicenses. I'd have to think through the licensing case a little bit more. But outside of the licensing case, I don't know that, I can't think of any other example where I actually care which input manifest I choose, if they're functionally equivalent because they produce the same output. Now, do folks have other notions other than the licensing case? And also, I want to roll back. Did that make sense to you, Robert? Because you're the one who originally brought up the point, and I don't want to stomp on your point.
I'm thinking about it, actually. I'm not sure.
I'm totally cool with you thinking about things. I'm totally cool with you disagreeing about things. The only thing I would object to would be you dropping your point because I'd said something emphatic. Don't do that.
Oh, no, no, I'm literally trying to thinking about it. I'm not sure.
Okay, so
Yeah.
backing up from that to a question that what I was thinking of as the sort of sneaky question, and this is really sort of particularly for the folks who do compiler games. One of the problems that comes up, so let's say that we decide that it doesn't really matter if it's an input manifest for this artifact, then we're perfectly fine writing the correlate, even if we're perfectly fine writing the correlate correlation, however, to point to whatever the latest input manifest that we see is, right? Then the next question that comes around, and this is me channeling my inner Jeremy, is what do you do about race conditions? And I don't expect race conditions to happen often, but God knows, every time in my entire career I've seen somebody say, oh, but that race condition will never happen. They're wrong. So I always do think about them. And by race condition, I mean, you have two things that are building a set of stuff for whatever reason, and they're both writing the output artifact. Now and they're both writing the output artifact. How do we avoid them stomping each other? So like, do we worry about it in compilers today? Two things trying to write the same file out at the same time?
No, I don't think that's been a problem that I've been dealing with. I've come across.
Okay.
Though occasionally, some file could get truncated, then that would mean that two bills have been trying to write to the same file at the same time. But that's, I think, very rare. I have not seen that in several thousands of bills that I.
Yeah, I tend to think about the world in terms of don't make things worse, if that makes sense, because it turns out that actually it's absolutely doable to it is absolutely doable to avoid that race condition 100% of the time. It involves a little bit of games with link operations, which are atomic in POSIX. But the fact that the compiler people aren't aware of playing that game means that, as you said, occasionally you can get a truncated file if you race against each other, but it happens so infrequently no one cares, would tend to make me suspect that this is a no one cares kind of situation here as well. Meaning that if we don't care about truncating the output in those rare circumstances, we wouldn't care about truncating the thing that correlates the input manifest to the output, correct?
Yes.
Does that make sense to folks?
So something to consider is if the only thing you have to work with is OmniBOR, then you're going to have a lot of information just because we don't collect the information. But if you pair it with other things, like let's say that you have the same output and multiple vendors or things that have produced that output, and let's say that you're looking at it from a perspective of who do I need to call so we can get this thing fixed, whether it's a CVE or a bug or performance issue. And so with that, it's like, oh, I see I can bring these things in. I have the gateways of those things. And then you look at, and then you cross that with your software bill of materials. And you say, oh, I know exactly which one I need to go and talk with. So in other words, it becomes a narrowing function. Am I affected? Yep. Am I impacted? And then from there, use that to call the right people.
That is a good thing to think about. Let's mull this a little bit for the next meeting. I apologize, I do have to leave because I got a hard stop at the top of the hour. But let's mull this a little bit because this may actually get us past this particular problematic point. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, excellent. I will talk to you all next week.